Hello, welcome to the second in our series of 8 classes in American slavery. I'm David Wilkins. Some have asked me why I chose the subtitle, No, Mr. West, Slavery Was Never a Choice, and I neglected to answer that question last class. Some of you recall 2 years or so ago, maybe 4 years or so ago, the rapper Kanye West in an interview made the statement with regard to American slavery that indeed slavery was a choice. Happened to be at a time when I was deep in my study of the subject, and I, along with many others, were deeply upset by the statement from Kanye. So I've used it ever since as a subtitle for my slavery classes. I think a very uh, positive affirmation of my belief that we have done a terrible job of teaching American slavery. And so I'll continue to use it because I think it's effective. I've shared my screen, so let's get into the class. From our last the class one, I've asked this question: what can American slavery teach us? Why is this a subject that I've become so enamored of since my retirement? I think, as we discussed last week, from our Teaching Hard History uh, program from the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance curriculum, we've done a poor job of teaching American slavery. You recall the video from Ibram Kendi pointing out the errors that continue to plague our textbooks, which are used today in the classroom. So I think we need to recognize that we've got work to do a better job of teaching, particularly secondary and elementary school children about this important aspect of American history. I think our understanding, and I spent some time, and I'll spend more time today talking about slavery in the ancient world, because I think our understanding of the world history, the history of the ancient world, helps us understand how our policies today have been influenced by that thinking. And that's why I'm taking this time to travel through Africa and the Iberian Peninsula in Europe in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. And then lastly, I think the inaccurate and incomplete histories continue to fuel our inaccurate and incomplete understandings of where we are today. Why do we continue to wrestle with this race issue in America? And it's, I think, because we've never addressed the core foundation of that issue as a function of American history. And therefore, I focus on it. Continuing the summary, we spent quite a bit of time on the 1619 project. I encourage those of you who have access to refer to it. I think it is very, very well done. And again, a very good general survey, not just of the 1619 issue, but of many of the issues that I think are germane to the subject we're studying, and so a good resource for you. So we're going to continue looking at slavery in the Old World today, and we're going to focus on how that evolves, again, as we get into ultimately the transatlantic slave trade, into the British colonies that would become the United States of America. And toward the end of the session today, we'll begin touching on that. And then in our third segment, we will really focus on those British colonies, on Jamestown, and that experience. Let me just conclude. I mentioned the Empire of Kush last week, the Malian Empire. We traveled with Kanka Musa, or the very wealthy Mansa Musa, as he did his Hajj and spread Malian gold and influence and learning all across Southern Europe and the Middle East in that process. Songhai was perhaps of these Western kingdoms, Ghana being the first, followed by Mali and then Songhai, of enormously influential impact. I focus on them because when we look at the transatlantic slave trade, we need to understand the role that this part of West Africa would play throughout the almost 300 years that we're going to be looking at. So for sheer size, few states in African history can compare to the Songhai Empire. Formed in the 15th century from some of the former regions of Mali, this West African kingdom was larger than Western Europe and comprised parts of a dozen modern-day nations. The empire enjoyed a period of prosperity thanks to vigorous trade policies and a sophisticated bureaucratic system that separated its vast holdings into different provinces, each ruled by its own governor. It reached its zenith in the early 16th century under the rule of the devout King Muhammad I Askia, who conquered new lands, forged an alliance with Egypt's Muslim Caliph, and established hundreds of Islamic schools in Timbuktu. While the Songhai Empire was once among the most powerful states in the world, it later crumbled in the late 1500s after a period of civil war and internal strife left it open to an invasion by the Sultan of Morocco. So envision again this ancient history, this ancient African experience that ranged for hundreds of years, long before Western civilization as we know existed, and understand that this is the locale of the drama that we're going to be exploring over the next few weeks. And so that's why I emphasize, and I also want to counter again the inaccuracies of much of the education I received, much of the education most American young people receive when they talk about Africa. You remember Henry Louis Gates's comment about how Africa was viewed by he and his classmates when they were in school, and that's the Tarzan Jane mythology, as opposed to our understanding that humankind begins in Africa, evolves over hundreds of years across Eastern Africa with Ethiopia, with Egypt, with the Black kings and queens of those empires, and in West Africa. And we've not even touched sub-Saharan Africa, Great Zimbabwe and Rhodesia. And we don't have time for that, but I do want, again, to leave that very, very strong message that Africa has always been a player in the global scene, but never viewed as a civilization led by, built by Black kings and queens. And that's a history that we need to learn better. Let me move then to a series of players, I'll call them, who would impact the thinking of the ancient world, beginning again with Aristotle here. And I pulled these names from Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. I made reference to Dr. Kendi's work last week. It is a brilliant, really catalog of the history of racist ideas, which is its subtitle. And he takes 4 or 5 important characters in our history, from Thomas Jefferson to Cotton Mather to W.E.B. Du Bois, even to Angela Davis in modern times, and shares with us how they influence this idea of race as an idea. So beginning with Aristotle, the original climate theorist. Now let me explain. Why are Black people Black? And this was always an issue. At least that was a question raised by people who were not Black. So there was the climate theory, the fact that black people, Africans were black because they were in extremely warm climates, and that was the reason that they were black. And Aristotle and many climate theorists would postulate that if exposed to cooler climes, they would indeed become white. This was a serious theory, and Aristotle subscribed to it, and is viewed as sort of the father of that thinking, and that would continue to be a theory for the next several hundred years. The curse theory we will look at was, again, the biblical story of Ham and the curse on Canaan from Noah. And that would be a bedrock theory for Christians and those who needed an explanation, essentially to justify the degradation of African people. And then there will be other theories, polygenesis and monogenesis, which we will look at later. But Aristotle, we begin because he had this very pro-Greek is best attitude, and he essentially formed this theory to support the Greek way of life and control over the Western Mediterranean. The quote from Aristotle: "Humanity is divided into two, the masters and the slaves, or if one prefers, the Greeks and the barbarians, those who have the right to command and those who are born to obey." So again, very, very simplistic view, but obviously a very pro-Greek view against the rest of the world. Interestingly, Herodotus, the father of history as we know it, had a very different view. Herodotus traveled to Africa, to Nubia or Kush, Egypt today, and encountered Nubians who he described as the most attractive of people he had ever met. Ibn Battuta is an interesting character, a Moroccan Muslim scholar, and also a traveler who traveled to Asia, India, China, and Africa, and challenged the prevailing thinking of scholars who, again, ascribed to this sort of climate theory of white is good, black is the result of the unfortunate location of these people in this very, very hot climate. Ibn Khaldun, a Tunisian scholar, was a Battuta antagonist. So you have these great Muslim thinkers fighting over their understanding of history, and so Khaldun adopts, again, Aristotle's climate theory, publishes a very influential history of the Muslim world in 1377, again ascribing the darker skinned people, once exposed to colder climes, could adopt, as he said, European characteristics. My guess is he was not a person of European characteristics himself, but chose to position himself in that way. Zurara is particularly interesting as we look at this list of characters who would influence the world's thinking about race and color. He was commissioned by Prince Henry the Navigator's nephew. If you don't know, Prince Henry the Navigator was the Portuguese prince who would fund many of the early explorations of Portuguese sailors, but was also responsible for developing sailing technology. Don't know if he was the creator of the caravel, which was a ship that allowed the Portuguese to sail south, but a very, very influential Portuguese character. So he commissions Zurara to do this bio of Henry's life. And so Zurara publishes the Chronicles of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea, which is the first recorded history of these anti-racist black ideas. The Portuguese would be the first to sail south, as I said. They would bring back 240 Africans to Lagos, Portugal in 1444. And Zurara framed the slave trading ventures as interestingly as missionary as opposed to profit seeking. Again, to make the efforts that were so clearly focused on gold and ivory and wealth, making it sound as though they were in fact carrying the cross into the land of these barbarians. At the same time that Zurara is doing this work, we need to recognize that, as we said last week, slavery is an ancient practice, a practice that every society in Europe, in Africa, in the islands, in the East, China, India, all practice. Most of the slaves at this time, so as Portugal and Spain begin their so-called explorations of discovery, most slaves were coming from the Slavic region, from the eastern, the Baltic Sea, from the Mediterranean, from Slavic nations. Indeed, so many of them were of Slavic background. It is the derivative, it is the word from which we get slave. And that would continue to be the case until about the 1400s, when these Slavic communities around the Baltic Sea began to protect themselves, to defend against Moroccan and Muslim slave raiders. A new source for labor needed to be found. Two other characters, Bartolome de las Casas, a very, very interesting gentleman who we will see play an important role again in the Spanish involvement in the New World. But his father takes him, and they begin their business. They buy land. They are enslavers. And ultimately find their way to Hispaniola, which is today's Haiti. And he also becomes a priest. And so he's sort of the first priest of the Spanish New World. And over the course of several years, being exposed to these brutal slave practices of the Spanish, he proposes that the Indians should no longer be enslaved, and by 1516, he's recommending that Africans instead be used as slave. And what's even more interesting, he goes back and he makes this case to the Spanish crown. Ultimately, the Spanish king in 1542 would order an end to the enslavement of indigenous peoples, and would opt instead to approve the use of Africans as slaves. In 1561, Las Casas's History of the Indies is published, and in it he regrets having made the recommendation to enslave Africans. Ultimately, he will be condemned for that position, will lose his standing at the court, and the publications of his works will be taken essentially off the shelf until discovered again several centuries later by other researchers. Lastly, Leo Africanus, another very interesting Muslim gentleman, happened to be very educated, travels with his father to the Songhai Empire. I mentioned Songhai at the beginning. In 1510, 8 years later, he's going to himself be enslaved while on a diplomatic mission, and will be presented to Pope Leo X in 1518. In 1526, Pope Leo will emancipate, and I'm using Leo Africanus's name that he will come to be known. It wasn't his name at the time. The Pope will emancipate him in 1521, give him the name Johannes Leo, and will commission him to write a survey of Africa. He'll publish this description of Africa in 1526 and continue again these racist mischaracterizations of African people. It's uncertain whether Johannes Leo actually traveled to these places, it appears that he was simply taking the writings of people like Zurara and Al-Khaldun and just building on it. But it would be translated into Latin and French and would influence French thinking for many years to come. So again, the focus here, these are in some instances historians, they are scholars, they are all well-positioned, powerful, influential men who will influence the society for many years beyond their deaths, and will obviously also touch on the importance of the thinking of the time. Lastly, John Locke. You might recognize the name, it's spelled differently. This is a descendant of the John Locke we know of the Enlightenment era. He will, on behalf of the English, make an expedition to Guinea. This would introduce the British, who will come to this exploration project much later than the Portuguese and the Spanish, but by 1554, he travels to Guinea. He will return with gold, ivory, and 5 enslaved Africans to London. And so London then is now playing catch up in this process. So let's look more directly at the origins of European exploration. This is a Khan Academy video that little monotone, but she does a very good job of explaining sort of how at least Portugal and Spain get into this work.
Hispaniola, but in this video, exploration in the Americas, we tend to start at 1492 with Christopher Columbus showing up at the island of Hispaniola. But in this video, I want to take a step back a few decades and talk about the conditions that led to Christopher Columbus's voyage in the first place. What was he doing there? So let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at what the world would have looked like to someone in Western Europe around the year 1450. So to a European, this would have been about the extent of the known world. Now, they wouldn't have had anything like the level of this detail, but they certainly knew that there were very good things to be had in India and China and the Middle East. Excellent trade goods like silk and spices. And they knew there was quite a lot of world outside of Europe and Africa, but they didn't think that there was much out there. They expected there would be some small islands on the range of Iceland, perhaps, but they had no conception that there were 2 gigantic continents on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. It's a frequent misconception that people in this time period thought that the world was flat. Learned people of the era knew that the world was round. In fact, they had known so since the time of the Greeks. What they did know was that the world was pretty large. In fact, they correctly estimated that the circumference of the globe is about 25,000 miles. And so they knew that given the shipping technology that they had, it would be impossible to go west and arrive at the east while still having enough food and water to supply your crew. Now, why would anyone have dreamt of going west to get east when they could have simply gone east to get east? Well, the answer is that the overland route was long and it was expensive because the Middle East and North Africa and even parts of Spain were controlled by Muslim empires like the Ottomans and the Moors. And so anytime trade came from the East, China, India, Middle East itself, it went through a series of traders and a series of empires along the way, picking up taxes and markups, which meant that by the time a good reached Western Europe, it was pricey indeed. And since Muslim traders were in control of the Mediterranean, here and at the east, taking a ship through there caused pretty much the same problem. So why not go around the coast of Africa? Well, that was certainly something that Europeans were keen to do. The only problem is that the wind goes in the wrong direction. It's very treacherous sailing around the tip of Africa to come up into the Indian Ocean. So what changed? How did this overland trade route become an oversea trade route? Well, for that, we have to look a little bit closer at the Iberian Peninsula. So this landmass here is the Iberian Peninsula. And at the time, the Iberian Peninsula was controlled by a number of different groups. The southern part was under Muslim control of the Moors, as they were called, or Moroccan Muslims. And they called this area Al-Andalus. We're talking about this area here. And the Spanish called it Granada. The western part here was under the control of Portugal, as it is today. Portugal. The eastern part, this area here, is the Kingdom of Aragon. And then the central part here was Kingdom of Castile. So as far as Europeans were concerned, this was kind of the end of the world. This was as far southwest as you could go on the European continent, and heaven knows what was out here. Until in the early 1400s, Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator began investing in navigation. And one of the important discoveries made by the Portuguese was a new kind of ship, and this ship was called the caravel. So what's cool about the caravel is that caravels are ocean-worthy, but they're also very easy to maneuver, and they can sail into the wind. So that means that the problems of sailing around Africa begin to get a little bit easier. And so in this early era of the 1400s, the Portuguese began expanding their exploration farther and farther down the coast of Africa. And they come across these islands now that they don't have to hug the coast, the Canary Islands. And farther west, this is so small you can barely see it here, Madeira and the Azores. And they quickly discover that these islands are ideal places to grow cash crops, specifically sugar. They also discover that some of the people who live on these islands, in fact, the Canary Islands had a native population called the Guanche. They immediately attempted to enslave these native people and then quickly discovered that they would die of disease. And we'll talk more about why native people seemed to be so susceptible to European diseases a little bit later. So now they have great places to grow sugar, but they don't have a workforce. Well, they're discovering another workforce along the coast of Africa as they begin to set up, this is the Portuguese we're talking about here, trading posts on the west coast of Africa, where they're purchasing slaves from African traders or Arab traders who had a long history of trading slaves from the interior of Africa out to its coast. So in the early 1400s, Portugal is doing very well for itself. Seems that they're leading this colonial game. They've pretty much invented the plantation system, and they're getting quite wealthy off of it. So the eyes of Europe turn to Portugal, and they think, all right, how can we replicate their success? Meanwhile, back on the Iberian Peninsula, there's a political and religious shakeup. So the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon are united when Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, and I recognize that my Spanish pronunciation is terrible, they get married in 1469 and unite their two kingdoms into what becomes the Kingdom of Spain. So what had been Castile and Aragon becomes Spain. And then united, these two Catholic monarchs turn their attentions to what's called the Reconquista. So reconquering the territories that had been controlled by Muslims for Christians. So I would call this kind of an extension of Crusader thinking. And Ferdinand and Isabella complete the Reconquista, expelling the Moors from the territory that is today Spain in 1492. So now we've reached 1492, and we've got a will, that is, a desire for luxury goods. We also have a little bit of good old-fashioned nationalism here. Spain's closest neighbor is Portugal, who are currently very powerful and wealthy. So they've got perhaps some rivalry in their hearts. And we've got a way, which is the caravel that is making more and more ocean sailing possible. And into this exciting moment steps Christopher Columbus, and we'll talk more about him in the next video.
Okay. Portuguese and Spain will be the first and largest players in this era of European exploration exploitation. The Moroccan Moors, or the Moors as the instructor in the video was saying, I think, warrant a class all by themselves. And I do intend one day to study to better understand, because we should never lose sight of the influence of Islam, of the Moors and Muslim traders all across Europe as it existed at the time, Asia, the Middle East, which I think is a term that's more common today, didn't really apply, North Africa, all the way across to South Africa. If you've traveled in West Africa, I should say not South Africa, but if you've traveled in West Africa, you know how strong is the influence of Islam even today. They rule the world literally for centuries, and we really have very little understanding of that. But we're going to focus on the role of Europeans, the Portuguese and the Spanish. We're going to look at the just horrendous impact they had on indigenous peoples as they so-called discovered the New World, the West, those islands, and the Americas. All of the four Atlantic-facing continents play in this transatlantic slave trade, as we'll develop it over the next couple of weeks. She mentioned disease, and we're going to touch on that particularly in the next slide as I introduce another of our scholars to this. But suffice to say, again, by 1514, Charles of Spain will abolish the enslavement of indigenous peoples because of Las Casas, his recommendations, his reports of the horrors, and Spain and Portugal, and ultimately all of the others, the Dutch, the French, the English, will turn to what they call the Guinea coast. Again, back to looking at that west coast of Africa. That's why I began there. Europeans refer to it as the Guinea Coast. It is a catch-all for really all of the west coast of Africa, from the north down to sub-Saharan Africa to Angola. Millions of acres and just hundreds of millions of people involved in what's going to become the transatlantic slave trade. Let me make a little detour. I've done some, as I've prepared this class, I continue to read, and The Other Slavery is an excellent book by Andreas Resendez. He is a professor of Latin studies at the University of California at Davis, I believe. I happen to listen to a podcast. He is now one of the contributors to the Teaching Hard History curriculum. This is the second season of their American slavery course. And he's spent two segments of that talking about what he calls the other slavery. And he's talking about the enslavement of indigenous peoples and Columbus's and the other Europeans' impact on those communities. By his count, 2.5 to 5 million indigenous peoples were enslaved, but don't get the attention they deserve, because we know a great deal more about the 10 to 12 million African people who were enslaved. He makes the point that regrettably, the history of the enslavement of indigenous peoples isn't as well documented as the enslavement of Africans, because you have shipping records, you have bills of sale, you have documentation of disembarkation, embarkation from the coast of Africa. As we'll see, we'll look at the voyages database hopefully later in this session. And so the record keeping around the enslavement of Africans is why we know so much about that part of the history of slavery. We don't know that much about what Professor Resendez calls the other slavery. And so this was slavery involving all of the European powers: Mexico, the Caribbean, Chile, and the colonies that would become the United States, and the southwestern part of the territories, which they were at that point. To Resendez, he said there were really four elements that make the other slavery as we know it. First, the forcible transfer from one location, which was essential. They were essentially raiding the islands for labor, and they had to move these people away from their tribes, from their homes, because obviously there was the potential that they could escape, or there could be retribution. Secondly, he said the inability of these people to return, to be relocated. They were being moved from typically islands in the Caribbean along the coast back to Europe, and obviously did not have the opportunity to return home. Thirdly, the use of force or the threat of force, like in every form of slavery, certainly with the enslavement of Africans. And then lastly, unpaid labor, free labor, or grossly underpaid labor. And so he paints this picture, and I think most interestingly, the distinction he makes between, as he says, Indian slavery never went away. He's making the point that while the King Charles of Spain outlawed the slavery of indigenous peoples in 1542, that did not stop the other forms of slavery, contract leasing, convict leasing, peonage, the essentially human trafficking of today. He makes the point that today there are 4 or more million people suffering, being human trafficked, and it's obviously illegal. But that's what would continue to happen to indigenous peoples, and continues to happen even today. He makes the point that Columbus was always a slave trader and only incidentally an explorer. My term, but I'm paraphrasing what Professor Resendez would say about Columbus. Columbus grew up in a slave society. He's Italian, and his father was a merchant. He would become a merchant. And again, slavery was common in Italy as it was in all other Mediterranean civilizations, all of the civilizations, as we said, and certainly, as I said again, the Baltic seas was a source of labor, unpaid labor, and that was true in Italy. After leaving Italy, Columbus would spend 10 years in Portugal. Prior to his first voyage to what he thought were the Indies, we know was to the coast of the Americas. So he's 10 years in Portugal working with Portuguese sailors and traders and going up and down the west coast of Africa. So he comes from a slave society, or certainly a society with slaves, and then he becomes very familiar with the project and profitability of slavery, of those plying that trade all along the coast. Elmina, is the last video showed, was certainly a big part of that. So by the time Columbus, 1492, makes his journey and his second and third journeys, he's certainly looking at the capture of indigenous peoples and bringing them back to the markets, the slave markets in the Mediterranean and all around Europe. And so let's make no exceptions, excuses for Christopher Columbus. He was a slave trader from the beginning and all throughout. A couple of other points, and just as one example, this is his experience in his second adventure with the Arawak Indians of the Bahamas. Now, all of the explorers, including Columbus and all of the others we talk about, expected to find gold, expected to find precious metals, certainly expected to find peoples that could be stolen and sold. Of course, Columbus expected to find rare objects of art, porcelain, precious teas, because he thought he was going to India, but of course he doesn't. So he goes to these islands, and he's then again looking for gold and slaves. He takes 100 or 500 Arawak indigenous people back to Spain to sell. Let's be clear. And in the search for gold, as this example points out, he establishes a quota and very brutally enforces that quota, as the slide suggests, by cutting off hands for those who fail to meet the quota. It is genocide on a mass scale. So by 1515, there were 50,000 Arawaks on Haiti. By 1550, there are 500. Hispaniola, as we know, Haiti today. So again, just want to be clear, when we talk about Columbus and teach Columbus, this is not being taught in our schools today. When we talk about hard history and how we have to do a better job of telling a fuller, complete story of European exploration and exploitation. Africans in Spain. So as we've said, and we'll continue to explore this concept of the Atlantic world as we get into looking at the colonies, the British colonies that will become America, there is a civilization around these 4 continents that face the Atlantic, and Africans played a part in all of them. Not always as enslaved people. There are countless examples of Africans who were sailors, who were navigators on each of the journeys of the very well-known explorers Balboa, Cortez, Nunez Cabeza. We will talk about him particularly here, as you see on the slide, and then Pizarro. I find Juan Garrido to be especially interesting, and I take a minute just to tell you his background. Born in West Africa in 1480 and arrived in Lisbon as a teenager and a free man. Again, many of these Africans were enslaved, some were not. He soon became a conquistador, sailing with Juan Ponce de Leon as part of the Spanish colonization of Puerto Rico and Cuba, and de Leon's expedition of Florida in 1513 and 1521. He also participated in Cortez's destruction of the Aztec Empire. Admittedly, in his papers, he recounts and tells these stories. He spent 7 years in Santo Domingo before settling in San Juan, Puerto Rico, where he fought with de Leon. His exploits with de Leon brought him to Florida, where he became the first African to reach lands embraced by the modern day United States. A point of again, back to the 1619 project, one of the criticisms of the project and of the focus on 1619 is that it is inaccurate to say that that was the first appearance or presence of people of African descent in the Americas. The Spanish and the Portuguese brought Africans like Garrido years before 1619. 1619 is the date when Africans were first sold in Jamestown, in the colonies that would become the US. So I want to continue to make that distinction because to some people it's controversial. I think it's clear to those of us who know that Africans were present in the Americas much before even these so-called conquistadors. I don't have time in this class to tell you the stories of the ancient Malian travelers to the Aztec Empire, to the Olmecs centuries before, but that's another class. So in 1524, the Spanish declare him a resident of Mexico City. They grant him a plot of land and named him the first doorman of the town council and caretaker of the city's aqueduct. Now, we don't think much of that a doorman is much of a title today, but it had some meaning, again, to the Spanish back in the 16th century. He dies in 1540. He addressed an account of his life in a petition to the King of Spain in 1538. He says, "I became a Christian in Lisbon of my own will, spent 7 years in Castile, landed in Santo Domingo, where I was for some time. From there, I ventured to San Juan, Puerto Rico, where I spent considerable time, afterwards landing in New Spain. I was present in the taking of Mexico City and in other conquests. I was the first to plant and harvest wheat in this land, from which has come all that there is now, and brought to New Spain many vegetable seeds." So this is taken from Henry Louis Gates' Life Upon These Shores, for those who want to look more closely at this gentleman. But I just find it fascinating that not only did he take part in horrible acts of genocide, obviously, but he makes a petition to the king to receive recognition for not only his role as a explorer and conquistador, but as a Spanish citizen, the first to bring these crops to the New World. Other examples. So by 1534, the 200 Africans accompany Alvaro to Ecuador. 1540 to 42, Africans accompany Alarcón and Vasquez de Coronado to Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. By 1570, there are 23,000 Africans living in Spanish colonial Mexico. We have to remember Mexico is a colony, would become an empire, much like the states that were British colonies and become the United States. Most were enslaved, but many would be able to purchase their freedom under the Spanish system of slavery. By 1810, there were more than 500,000 free people of color living in New Spain, about 10% of the population. My favorite story, and actually a story that I share with my wife, is the story of Esteban. We visited Denver, where her father still lives, and we discovered at a marvelous museum and library in the Five Points area of Denver, the Blair Calder Library. It is both a library, a African American Culture Center, and a museum. At the top of the museum, they have I think, one of the country's best collections of African American history and art of the West, of the Southwest in particular. And I found this exhibit of Esteban. Let me give you a little background. So it's 1528, and he's landing in Tampa Bay with Panfilio de Narvaez. Again, one of the members of this crew. They leave their ship and they march inland and immediately begin dying of hunger and thirst. Again, as would be true in too many instances, the Portuguese and the Spanish would come unprepared, not knowing where they were going, and obviously would die in huge numbers. They found no gold, but they built a craft with the remaining 250 men, hoping to cross the Gulf to a Spanish settlement that had pre-existed, obviously. They run into a hurricane and are shipwrecked on what's today Galveston Bay. Narvaez and a handful of men survive, but most would be lost in fighting with the local indigenous peoples, with the Indians. Only 4 survive. Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, a gentleman who Professor Resendez writes another very important historical account. Alonso de Castillo, Andres Dorantes, and Esteban, or Estebanico, as he's called. He was Dorantes' personal slave. So you have this African who travels with this group of explorers, most of whom die. He survives, and the 4 of them will go on to survive for a period of time, encountering Indians, living with Indians in what is today parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and they use their knowledge of European medicine, and they become known as healers. And it's what saves their lives. They learn several Indian languages and become intermediaries between Spanish raiders and native peoples. Ultimately, they're honored as healers and given ceremonial gourds that establish their standing among native peoples. And what you see here is an artist rendition of Esteban. He has the gourd, he's accompanied by these dogs, and he's dressed as his one of the a friar who travels with them. He says he certainly didn't look like that when they got off the Galveston Bay, but this is what he's accomplished in the time there. The Viceroy of New Spain will send a search party looking for Cabeza de Vaca. He's the leader of and one of the 4 remaining members, and they're using Esteban as a guide. There's some disagreement among historians as to the ultimate end of Esteban. Some say he was killed by Zuni Indians in New Mexico in 1539. Others say he slipped away into the mountains with the rebels and is again a hero to certain communities still today. So an interesting story about an African in the New World, and again another example. Not every person of African descent comes to the New World as a slave. Some come as explorers, conquistadors, and some leave their mark, as did Juan Garrido and Esteban. Let's move quickly to the British. I said the British would come late to this game once they realized that the Portuguese and the Spanish are increasing their empire. They are becoming wealthy through these gold finds that they make in some of the Caribbean islands. I neglected to mention, let me just go back, this issue of the disease as the source of the high death rate among indigenous people. Certainly that was true. The transfer, infection of indigenous peoples who had no immunities from their encounter with Europeans is a reality. Andres Resendez, the author we spoke about 2 or 3 slides back, argues that we also have to account for the dislocation. In places like Hispaniola, where the indigenous people literally were worked to death, today, modern day Haiti, that labor force was replaced by the Spanish and Portuguese going to surrounding islands. They did not find the mineral wealth that they found on Haiti or at the Bahamas, but they did find people, and they moved those people from those smaller islands to be that workforce. And simply the movement of those people, their first time exposure again to these Europeans contributed again to that very, very high death rate. But as we look at the British and the Dutch, who would come later, we see the first presence of these Europeans. Jan Rodriguez is an Atlantic Creole, and we'll talk about that concept, the Atlantic Creole, but works for the Dutch West Indian Company, 1613. 1619, the 20 and odd Negroes that we've already talked about. 1627, the Dutch West Indian Company sees a Portuguese vessel, and Angolan captives are now delivered to New Amsterdam, New York, as we know today. And then 1634, another Atlantic Creole would be among the original residents of Maryland, an English Catholic colony. Let's pause and allow some Q&A if there are questions. Okay, let's move formally then into a discussion of the Atlantic slave trade, beginning with a short video clip from Ted Ed.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy. The Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion, and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians, needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
So I begin the discussion of the Atlantic or transatlantic slave trade with this video because I think it does an excellent job, high level, obviously, but touching on some critically important points for us to keep in mind as we go forward. He referenced slaves versus serfs versus indentured servants. And we're going to get into those differences, but I think we are familiar with the idea of the Russian serf. If any of us have studied European history, Russian history, these were the landless peasants who worked on the large estates of the wealthy Russian lords. Indentured servants were, in our experience, poor people who would come from Europe, usually England in the case of the colonies that would become the US, and would work for a period of years, usually 7. And once completed, they would be free and would be treated as any other colonist with the opportunities to improve their station in life. Slavery, as we are studying and will come to understand, was distinctly different from these two, and we can't ever lose sight of that. They didn't have those options that the indentured servant. People often confuse that as we've seen in looking at the textbooks early on. The other point among the many good ones that Hazard makes is this view that Africans had of people they enslaved. As we said at the beginning, slavery has always existed in all civilizations, in all societies, and Africans didn't view slaves any differently than did the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, or any other society, the Chinese, the Indians. They were people who had the misfortune to have been captured in war or committed a crime, and they were punished by being made slaves. It was the creation of this racial basis, this justification in our American experience that distinguishes our slavery from the experience, again, of all of these other civilizations. This is why we begin in Africa. A, it is where we all began, but B, Africa is the source ultimately of the 10 to 12 million people who would be transported to the Americas. But we have to, again, understand that this mindset, because you often hear the question, well, didn't the Africans sell each other to the slave traders? Africa is a continent made up of different countries, as we've seen in antiquity and even to today. Africa is not a monolith, and Africa was, the countries that make up Africa were no different than countries in Europe, in Asia, and ultimately in the New World. The view of slavery had nothing to do with the color of people's skin. That was a creation of the colonist in British America that would become the US. We're going to focus more on that, but I don't want to leave this without emphasizing that point. So again, an overview of the slave trade out of Africa, 1500 to 1900. Captive Africans followed many routes from their homeland to other parts of the world. This map shows the transatlantic movement of these captives in comparative perspective for the centuries since 1500. This comes from the Slave Voyages database, which we will focus on throughout this course. It is a marvelous resource. Emory University sponsored the project, but it is the collective work of scholars across the world. And I think it is the key resource used by researchers today trying to understand this history. Estimates of the ocean-borne trade are more robust than are those for the trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and Persian Gulf routes. But it is thought that for the period from the end of the Roman Empire to 1900, about the same number of captives crossed the Atlantic as left Africa by all other routes combined. So simply think of the numbers of people out of Africa. Think of what Professor Hazard said in the video clip about the impact of those thefts of peoples to other places, the displacement of communities and families. And we understand today why in too many instances, parts of Africa still suffer from the lack of simply the human structure necessary to be competitive. I won't take time to read. I'll send you, there is a marvelous overview of the slave trade, but this gives you an idea just visually of what the previous slide was trying to suggest. You see the numbers represented by the black markers of the people, and what we're going to understand in our study as we focus increasingly on slavery in what's going to become the United States. Only about 500,000 people of African descent would find their way to, let's call it the US, and almost 5 million would find their way to the West Indies, to Haiti, to the Caribbean islands. And then we'll talk about those differences because they are significant. You see the number heading to Europe, the 5 million who head to Brazil. My wife and I have had the pleasure of traveling to Brazil 2 or 3 times. Salvador is a beautiful part of the country, and it is the place where today people of African descent predominate in the culture, in the life of that part of Eastern Brazil. It's beautiful. Again, I'll include an overview. It's about a 1.5-page long description of this experience. Okay, let me see what's going. Proceed here. There was another slide. Let me pause and see if I can replay that. Come out of the slide and go back here. All right, let's see if we can get this. This is again from the Slave Voyages database, and I think does a much better job of describing this part of the journey than I can. Let's hope that we get it to play.
Between 1500 and 1867, more than 40,000 voyages set sail from Africa to the Americas, crammed with 12.5 million unwilling migrants who had been sold into slavery in exchange for European trade goods. A set of complete plans has survived for just one of these ships. The ship was the Aurore, which left La Rochelle in France on August 28, 1784, bound for the African coast. The captives it obtained there were taken to Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, in the Caribbean, and sold to the owners of sugar and coffee plantations. We close in just before the ship arrives on the African coast to get a clear view of the conditions that approximately 600 captives had to endure on their 2-month middle passage to the Caribbean. The Aurore was a typical 18th century slave ship. The main deck shows 2 key features designed to control the male slaves. First, the barricado, a 9-foot high wooden wall that divided the ship in 2. This was topped with spikes and swivel guns. Second, 2 iron chains can be seen running along the upper deck. Every morning, the crew brought the shackled male captives up onto the deck from the spaces they had slept in overnight. The crew locked the main shackles into the chain to restrict movement. African men were not only chained in place, but continually within the firing line of the swivel guns. African women and children were imprisoned behind the barricado, normally unshackled, where they could neither see the men nor speak to them. Fearful that the male captives might escape their chains and try to capture the ship, the majority of the crew also remained behind the barricado. We descend from the quarterdeck to the officers' quarters and galley. A cook prepared the slaves' food in this boiler. The captives' diet consisted mainly of a starch such as rice, beans, or flour. Enslaved people were forced to eat this monotonous diet twice a day. They drank just 2 pints of water daily, leading to constant and often deadly dehydration. As the sun began to set, the crew, armed with whips and guns, forced the slaves below deck. The space below was divided by wooden walls to keep the men and women separated. The men were released from the deck chains and forced below, still shackled in pairs. Once below deck, crewmen packed the enslaved men together. Some were forced to lie on top of the platforms around the side of the room. Others lay under the platforms. Each captive on or under a platform, slept in a space just 14 to 18 inches wide and 30 inches high. Most were forced onto their sides and pressed against their neighbors. Others sat in their meager intervening spaces. The Aurore's prisoners spent at least 14 hours in such cramped, dirty, and stifling conditions, which they endured daily for 2 or 3 months before reaching the Caribbean. We have no contemporary depictions of the Aurore's 600 captives as the vessel left Malimba to cross the Atlantic Ocean. We do, however, have an image of a crammed lower slave deck painted on a voyage of a smaller slaver, the Marie Séraphique, from just a few years earlier. This comes into view in an overlay as the camera zooms out. The overlay shows only 340 captives, while the Aurore carried almost twice this number.
So again, this is a clip that's contained in the Voyages database. We're going to look at some other work from that source. But it reminds me, as I've said at the beginning, resistance is an important aspect, every aspect of understanding American slavery. Again, enslaved people resisted on being captured in their home locations in Africa, resisted enslavement at the forts awaiting to be put on these ships, resisted on the ships, and then resisted in innumerable ways all throughout the almost 300 years of slavery's history in the colonies that would become the U.S. It's estimated that there was a slave uprising on at least 10% of the thousands of slave Middle Passage voyages. The one story that comes to mind is from Bonnie Greer's podcast In Search of Black History. I mentioned this last week, and she recounts the story of the Unity, which was a slaver, I believe, out of Portugal or Spain. And in the story, she tells from the captain's log. So the attempted revolt was put down, and punishments were meted out. And in this particular story, and there are 2 or 3 others she tells, of women who were punished as a result of an attempted uprising on the ship. You saw the battlements in the Aurore that were in place because of the threat, the constant threat of slave uprising on the ship. And in the story that Greer tells, the women who are unnamed are simply identified as 3 women, 2 of whom are executed after there's an investigation by the captain of the attempt. And so she makes the point, so that it's not lost, that while enslaved men and women were separated, as the video clip would show, there was the ever-present threat from both parts of the population, those who were chained and not. And obviously, in the instance, as the captain tells the story in the Unity, these women were executed in the presence of all of the other enslaved people to send the message that they would be dealt with summarily, as was the case. And so we need to understand, with all of the other horrors attendant to this Middle Passage, there was nothing that the captains would not do, because they were also investors in these journeys. They owned some of these people and were going to sell them for their own profit, as well as the pay that they would get from the ship owners. And so it's a brutal, brutal enterprise, as this slide shows us. And just another way to look above deck. Below deck, you see the netting that is placed around the sides of the ship to prevent the suicide, which was all too frequent a way for enslaved people to end their enslavement. Let's move on. I want to really conclude today by looking again at the Voyages database. The Olaudah Equiano video is a good one. He tells the story of his own capture and his journey to the Middle Passage. I'll try to attach that clip to an email so you can see that. But Olaudah Equiano is one of the best known slave narratives that is available today. And he tells the story of being stolen from his native land, brought to the US, and ultimately will gain his freedom. He happens to be an educated man, and tells, again, the story of this horrific practice from the perspective of someone who has seen the world, happens to find himself in this terrible circumstance, and survives to tell, not only tell, but to write his narrative. The Voyages database, as I've said, is a marvelous tool. I'll include a link to that as well. This is just one of the resources. So what you see here are the transatlantic slave trade estimates. So this is how we get to, when we talk about 10 to 12 million people transported. If you would see the date range here from 1501 to 1875, we'll talk about how the various participants in the trade would end their country's participation in the trade, but that trade would continue illegally for many years for most of these. But what you see here across the top are the participating countries, and then you see the numbers. If you look here at the U.S., the number of Africans stolen, delivered to the U.S., resulting, again, when you total all of the countries, all of the eras, all of and these are documented men, women, and children, a large percentage of children. This is where we get the number, again, ranging between 10 to 12, and never lose sight of the fact that a tragically large percent of the people stolen and transported would not survive. And so this 12 million would be those who disembarked, but doesn't include the millions more who died in the capture in Africa and in the Middle Passage. And this just another look, again, from the Voyages database that gives you a sense of the time frame, again, from 1525, and this is simply a timeline showing the activity level. And I'll again include a link and encourage you to spend some time looking at not just the slides like this, but there are some segments, reports that detail much of this story. And I thought this one was particularly interesting, just showing you how over time these various things lead. And these are just the increase in numbers of people as these different events from 1 through 12 transpire. So let's stop here. We've got perhaps some questions, and we'll pick it up again in our third segment next week. Thank you very much.